I'm Dr. Winder. I'm a neurologist, but I have an interest in stroke, and have been doing that for the last 25 years, but I've done research since the mid-80s. Most of my research is clinical research, so at the bedside with patients that have had injuries from ischemic strokes. The types of injuries that we see are traumatic, obviously, so things, people falling off buildings, something hitting them on the head, car accidents. And then there can be the other types of brain injuries where people have, circulatory problems, and the biggest one that we see is, stroke, ischemic stroke. So the brain gets damaged because of a lack of blood supply and lack of oxygen to the brain. But there are those two broad categories of injuries: traumatic, and then the acquired injury from, circulatory disturbances such as stroke. The biggest issue in a broad sense is the loss of brain tissue and the loss of function associated with that brain tissue. So if you lose an area that's fairly eloquent in the brain, such as the speech area, the biggest issue we have is oftentimes that's gone. If you lose it, you can't speak again. And there are people that are mute. They are unable to talk after their stroke. Or if they are able to regain some speech, it's not intelligible anymore and they have trouble understanding language. So when we see patients with brain injuries, our biggest concern is that loss of brain function that is associated with that injury. That's the big concern that we have. It could be motor function, could be speech function, could be vision, whatever part of the brain is damaged. If that area is permanently damaged and gone, then that function is lost. I think the biggest issue that we have, with adult human brains, and that's what I'm going to confine myself to, is we're very highly evolved, since the development of the neocortex, and I think it's a very specialized brain. And I think when functions are lost, there isn't a lot of capacity for other parts of the brain to take over. There is, to some degree, and that we look at as the plasticity that exists in the brain, and I think we see that in children that have strokes. They tend to do better than adults because their brain is still growing, and it hasn't finished growing until they get into maybe their late teens, early 20s. So a child who has a stroke, maybe at birth, can actually do reasonably well. But an adult, somebody who's in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they have a stroke, the brain at that point in time is already being fixed, and as far as we understand, doesn't really grow anymore or change. Now that concept is changing as well, that we think there is still that potential that you might be able to stimulate the brain to perhaps repair damage. And I think that's the exciting part that, perhaps some of the research that you fellows are doing might help us. We talk about stem cells, but we also talk about, is there a possibility for stimulating the brain to, recover itself? And that's the potential that exists. And that has always been the limit, is that we never thought the brain could do that. And I think that's been a bit of a paradigm shift, probably in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, where we're actually now realizing that the brain may have a potential for recovery, an adult human brain. And so what that means is it opens the possibility that if you are able to find out what are the switches that you could flip to actually get the brain to recover itself, because just leaving somebody on their own, we don't think there is the great potential, but maybe through rehabilitation, maybe through medications, maybe through various programs, you might be able to get the brain to recover, and perhaps even some of the work that you're doing, some genetic research, that might help the brain recover. Right now we're limited to preventing further damage after patients have had an injury. So for example, stroke, the biggest thing is preventing secondary events. Rehabilitation, which I think really focuses, and there's clear evidence in the clinical studies that rehabilitation tries to stimulate the brain's plasticity to have other parts of the brain take over function. And so that's where rehabilitation has a real important role in recovery from brain injury, whether it be traumatic or stroke-type injuries. I think the thing that's wide open is still this area: is there a potential that the brain endogenously, just by itself, has that capability if we could just throw the switch I mean, right now we're doing rehabilitation and we try to prevent second events, but imagine if you could find out what is the factor that could turn on stem cells, which already exist and reside in human brains, to recover. So in other words, if you've lost neurons, can you regrow neurons? You know, or if you have other cells that could take over the function, like glial cells. You know, and I think we thought previously glial cells were relatively static, just a support structure, but I think they're much more than just the structure. You know, and I think microglial cells and all these other cells, that's part of the dynamic of research that's been going on. I mean, these are not just glue that holds neurons in place. They actually do things. And I think that's the exciting part of the research that's going on right now. I think it's probably just the limits of the brain to sort of adapt and take over function that's been lost. That's kind of the limit. I mean, you know, you can do rehabilitation and secondary prevention all you want, but sometimes if you've just lost too much brain tissue, the remaining brain that's left cannot take over that function. And I think that's where the limits are. I mean, and we see that all the time. Patients go for rehabilitation and they have just small amount of recovery because they've just lost too much brain tissue. And I think that's the big issue, is that what do you do in those patients who have got large areas of damage, and you know that they're probably not going to do that well from rehabilitation? It's not that, you know, they don't participate, and it's not that it's not done, but you just kind of know that they've had too much damage and they're just not going to be able to recover that function. So I think that's the limit. It's just the size of an injury. It's going to be the limiting factor. It depends on how you develop the gene therapy and how it's proposed, and you know, and the safety that's associated with it. Because I mean, I think part of any research that you're doing at a basic level, you've got to demonstrate safety, because otherwise it'll never come to the clinical bedside, which is what we want as clinicians. We want research that has been shown to be efficacious, but it's also been shown to be safe. So in other words, if you can demonstrate that you can do something and it's safe, and it has the desired outcome, which is there is recovery of brain function, or regeneration of brain tissue that is safe, then I'd say sure. I think people will obviously be very supportive of that. But I think the big question everybody always has, is it safe and does it work properly? Which doesn't make sense, but that's how research is done. It's done at the bench, with microorganisms, and then with small animals, and eventually it works its way up, and it probably takes years to get there, and finally it gets proven that this might be useful, and then it makes the next step, which is to the clinical bedside where you're actually testing it. And I think that's going to be the biggest issue, is showing results and showing safety. The general population are definitely going to want that, but clinicians are going to want that. People who deal with patients are going to say, show me it's safe and show me that it works. Then I'll think about it and we can do something. But, lots of studies have fallen by the wayside because they can show that it maybe is efficacious, but it's not safe. Or they may show that it's safe, but it doesn't really work that well. So it's getting those two together. I think that's going to be the tough part. But, that doesn't mean it can't be done, and it doesn't mean that somebody won't discover something along the way. And I think that's the whole point. That's why research is done, and that's why it's encouraged, because we learn from that. I think it holds possibility. Just from what I know, I think there's the potential that it may be very important. I don't want to say that it's going to be the answer, but it has the potential. If it achieves some degree of recovery of brain function, then that's a success. If you can say, well, look, we can use genetic engineering to encourage brain cells to regenerate or to reposition themselves so that cells are redirected in a different pathway so they can take over function that's lost. I'd say that's a success, as long as it's safe, and patients, don't have undue risk associated with that. And I would say that's a successful, objective to work towards.
So I'd say genetic engineering has potential. I mean, it's not like this is the first time that genetic engineering has been talked about. I mean, it's been looked at for inserting genes into children that have muscular dystrophy to try and correct the muscular dystrophy, and that's been going on probably for 20 years. Just the brain is a little bit more of an intricate computer to work on. If you want to think of it, it's a pretty amazing computer when you think of the billions of neurons that are there and how they all work in concert. And then when you lose a whole chunk, it's like, that's a big problem. How do you get that back? You know, and that would be the interesting part if we could get that recovery back.